Welcome to The King's Historian. Tonight we're diving into the story of Peter the Great, the Tsar who transformed Russia. If you enjoy quiet stories from history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. In the year 1672, Moscow was not the glittering capital we imagine today. It was a maze of wooden houses, crooked streets, and onion-shaped church domes poking through clouds of chimney smoke. Russia was still a land ruled by boyars, nobles who wore long beards and longer robes, and by old traditions that clung as tightly as the winter cold. When Peter Alexeyevich Romanov was born, few could guess that this baby would one day drag his entire country kicking and screaming into the modern world. Peter was born into power, but not peace. The Romanov family was tangled in politics, rivalries, and whispers of betrayal. His father, Tsar Alexei, had ruled with strict religious devotion. After his death, the royal court became a nest of ambitious relatives and jealous nobles. Even as a child, Peter's future looked uncertain. He was just another prince in a family that could barely agree on who should sit on the throne. Russia itself was like an old bear, huge, strong, but asleep through most of the world's progress. Western Europe had ships, science, and trade. Russia had frozen ports, wooden plows, and beards so long they could hide a spoon. The world was changing fast, but Russia preferred to stand still. The people were loyal to tradition, the church ruled everyday life, and foreigners were looked at with suspicion as if they carried invisible diseases called ideas. Even as a child, Peter didn't fit into this sleepy world. He was tall, ridiculously tall, shooting up like a bean sprout in a land of potatoes. People whispered that he was blessed by God or cursed by giants. He was curious about everything: clocks, weapons, ships, even how watermills worked. While other children played with wooden toys, Peter tried to take apart real ones. He wasn't just a prince, he was a tiny tornado with a crown. The Streltsy, Russia's elite guards, stalked the corridors in tall fur hats, loyal to whoever fed them best. Rival queens and boyars whispered against each other. For young Peter, every day was a lesson in survival. But instead of hiding, he learned by watching, studying power the way a cat studies its prey. When he wasn't dodging palace politics, Peter escaped to the German quarter on the outskirts of Moscow. This neighborhood was filled with foreign merchants, shipbuilders, and soldiers who spoke strange languages and drank even stranger amounts of beer. For most Russians, it was a suspicious place. For Peter, it was paradise. He would wander through workshops, eyes wide, asking endless questions in broken German. What does this do? How do you make that move? They laughed, but they also saw something special in him. His favorite discovery was ships. The first time Peter saw one, it wasn't even on water. It was an old, half-rotted English boat abandoned in a field. But to him, it was magic. He begged someone to fix it, learned how sails worked, and spent hours pushing it along the riverbanks. That single boat, people say, was the spark that lit his lifelong obsession. While other royals dreamed of thrones, Peter dreamed of oceans. The boyars mocked him for dressing like a sailor instead of a noble. Even his family thought his behavior was un-Tsar-like. Peter didn't care. He built small cannons, practiced carpentry, and gathered a gang of other young nobles who shared his strange interests. They called themselves the Play Army, though their games often involved real gunpowder and bruised noses. Behind the laughter, though, Peter was training himself for something much bigger. He studied how European armies marched, how ships were built, how rulers like the Dutch and English managed their governments. Each new thing he learned chipped away at the old Russia he saw around him. He didn't know it yet, but he was preparing for war, not just against enemies, but against centuries of tradition. By the time he reached his teenage years, Peter was already towering over grown men, nearly 7 feet tall, loud, curious, and full of restless energy. The old nobles shook their heads, saying, "This boy will bring trouble." They were right. Peter wasn't meant to follow the old ways. He was born to break them, and in doing so, he would drag an entire nation out of its medieval sleep, one ship, one beard, and one cannon at a time. When Peter's father, Tsar Alexei, died, the royal court turned into a snow globe of chaos. Nobles whispered in corners, old women crossed themselves, and everyone argued about which son should wear the crown. Russia didn't have an easy rulebook for such moments. The throne was like a hot potato. No one wanted to drop it, but touching it could burn you. Ivan was gentle but sickly, often too weak to stand through long ceremonies. Peter, on the other hand, was strong, restless, and already taller than most soldiers. The court couldn't decide who should rule, so naturally they chose both. Because in Russia, even royal chaos comes in pairs. Of course, 2 Tsars meant double the drama. Sophia, their half-sister, stepped in claiming she could help rule, which really meant ruling herself. She charmed nobles, bribed guards, and whispered her way into power. While Ivan nodded along politely, young Peter watched from the sidelines, building toy cannons and pretending not to notice that his sister had just hijacked the empire. Sophia enjoyed ruling until the Streltsy, Russia's elite guards, decided to make things interesting. They wanted more pay, more respect, and maybe a little chaos on the side. In 1682 they erupted in open rebellion, Moscow filled with screams, smoke, and steel. The Streltsy stormed the Kremlin, dragged officials out of windows, and painted the palace floors red. It was Peter's first real taste of what power costs, and it tasted like iron and fear. Little Peter, just 10 years old, hid in terror as the Streltsy murdered his mother's friends before his eyes. He never forgot it. From that moment he hated both rebellion and weakness. While others saw soldiers, he saw a mob that had nearly killed him. Years later, when he'd face the Streltsy again, he would remember that day, and he would make them remember it too. After the blood dried, Sophia ruled openly as regent, using Ivan as a puppet and Peter as a problem to contain. She decorated Moscow with her portraits, held lavish feasts, and tried to act like a queen. But Peter didn't sit quietly. He spent his days outside the city building toy fortresses, drilling small units of boys dressed like real soldiers. Locals laughed until they saw those toys firing real cannons. Peter's backyard army became the Preobrazhensky Regiment, a training ground for future generals. He learned how to drill, march, and command, not from dusty scrolls but by doing it himself. He was building a new kind of Russia in miniature, disciplined, modern, and loyal to him alone. The boyars shook their heads. Just a phase, they said. It wasn't. When Peter turned 17, he decided he'd had enough of his sister's helpful guidance. The Streltsy were restless again, and their loyalty was starting to wobble. Using a mix of charm and cannon barrels, Peter's supporters seized control of the Kremlin. Sophia was dragged from her palace and locked inside a convent. Peter didn't have her executed, a rare act of mercy, but he made sure she'd never hold power again. With Sophia gone and Ivan too ill to rule, Peter finally became the true Tsar of Russia. He was still young but already different from any ruler before him. He laughed loudly, cursed freely, and worked with his own hands. He loved shipyards more than thrones. To the nobles he looked uncivilized, to Peter they looked hopelessly boring. The winds of change were beginning to howl through Moscow, and Peter was the storm. For the first time Russia had a ruler who wanted to learn instead of just command. Peter studied maps, foreign trade routes, and European science. He practiced carpentry, sailing, and even dentistry, not for fun but because he believed a Tsar should understand the work of his people. His reign was still young, but already the old world was trembling. The boy who once hid from rebels was now preparing to rebuild an empire, and maybe, just maybe, himself. By 1697, Peter the Great was restless. He had learned everything Russia could offer, and that wasn't much by European standards. While other nations sailed across oceans, Russia was still arguing about beard length. So Peter decided to do something no Russian ruler had ever done: leave the country. Not for war or diplomacy, but to learn. He wanted to see with his own eyes how the West worked, how they built ships, ruled cities, and stayed clean without freezing to death. But Peter didn't travel like a Tsar. That would have ruined the fun. Instead, he disguised himself as a common soldier named Sergeant Pyotr Mikhailov. It wasn't the best disguise. He was 7 feet tall and had royal manners, but people pretended not to notice. With a group of nobles and craftsmen, Peter formed what was called the Grand Embassy, a traveling Russian classroom on legs. Their first stop was the Dutch Republic, the shipbuilding capital of Europe. Peter worked at the docks in Zaandam, hammering planks, learning to caulk, and asking so many questions that the foreman started hiding during lunch. Locals thought he was a strange giant carpenter who didn't know when to quit. To Peter, every splinter was worth it. The sea had always called to him. Now he was learning its language. Soon word got out: a Russian Tsar is working in the docks. Crowds gathered just to see him. Embarrassed, Peter moved to a quieter shipyard in Amsterdam, where he could work without turning heads. He learned to handle sails, repair masts, and design naval cannons. At night he sat by candlelight sketching ships, dreaming of building a navy back home that could make Russia proud, or at least float for more than 5 minutes. But Peter's curiosity didn't stop at boats. He visited hospitals, museums, and scientific laboratories. He examined skeletons, stared through telescopes, and even tried his hand at dentistry, pulling teeth from volunteers with suspiciously shaky hands. One British observer wrote, "He works like a man possessed." Peter didn't care about manners or royal dignity. He wanted knowledge, not titles. When he reached England, he met with King William III, toured Greenwich Observatory, and practically moved into the Royal Navy's shipyards. He even rented a mansion by the Thames, which he quickly wrecked. He and his companions practiced navigation indoors, breaking furniture, flooding floors, and scaring servants. The English called him the Carpenter King. The neighbours just called the landlord to complain. Everywhere he went, Peter picked up ideas like souvenirs, government systems, printing presses, even how to hold a fork properly. He watched parliaments in session, visited factories, and studied city planning. To him, the West was a toolbox, and he was already building the new Russia piece by piece. Still, he couldn't help laughing at some customs: powdered wigs, tiny cups of tea, and shoes so small they looked like punishments. Just as he was settling into his European adventure, bad news struck. Another Streltsy uprising back home. The same soldiers who haunted his childhood were rebelling again. Peter's temper boiled. He dropped his tools, gathered his entourage, and rushed back to Russia. His journey of learning had ended. Now came the lesson in fear. When Peter returned, Moscow was trembling. The Streltsy thought he'd gone soft in Europe. They were wrong. He crushed the rebellion without mercy. Executions, torture, public displays of punishment. It was brutal, even by Russian standards. But Peter saw it as cleansing, burning out the rot before rebuilding the body. To him, discipline was the first step toward progress. No matter how many heads rolled, Rond Krankov the bloodshed, Peter sat in silence, staring at the horizon. He had seen Europe's brilliance and Russia's stubbornness. He knew what needed to change, but he also knew change would not come gently. The boy who once hid from rebels had become a man who crushed them. The Carpenter King was gone, the Iron Tsar had arrived, and soon he would turn his hammer not on wood, but on Russia itself. When Peter came back from Europe, he wasn't the same man. He'd left as a curious traveller and returned as a storm with boots on. He'd seen how Europe lived, the order, the ships, the science, the coffee, and he wanted it all for Russia. But Russia wasn't ready for him. The nobles still wore long robes, the church still ruled minds, and the people still believed the world ended somewhere past Poland. Peter looked around and thought, "We've got a lot of work to do." The first thing he did was grab his hammer, metaphorically speaking, and start smashing old habits. The boyars had grown fat and lazy, sitting in velvet chairs while Europe sprinted ahead. Peter ordered them to get off their cushions and join the army, the navy or government service. "If you want honor," he said, "earn it." Titles were no longer about birth. They'd have to be earned through sweat, not family trees. Russia gasped. No one had ever spoken to nobles like that. Next came the beards. Russians loved their beards. The church said shaving was a sin, claiming God himself had one. Peter disagreed. He believed clean-shaven faces looked civilized, like Europeans. So one morning, he walked into a gathering of nobles with scissors in hand and started snipping. One by one the beards fell. Gasps echoed through the hall. Some men begged to keep theirs, so Peter made a deal. They could keep their facial forests if they paid a special beard tax. Bureaucracy had found its first victim, vanity. He didn't stop there. Peter banned long, heavy robes and replaced them with short European coats. He set rules for table manners, demanded forks instead of fingers, and even made nobles attend balls where they had to dance with women. For Russians raised on stiff tradition, this was like being forced to juggle on command. But Peter wanted his court to look like Paris, not a monastery. Slowly, awkwardly, the nobles began to twirl. To keep up with his grand plans, Peter needed money, lots of it. He reformed taxes, created government departments, and squeezed every corner of the country for revenue. New industries were ordered into existence: shipbuilding, mining, textiles, glassmaking. If Russia didn't have an industry, Peter invented one. He recruited foreign experts, often paying them with promises instead of rubles. The result was messy, noisy, and halfway functional, but it worked. Peter also reorganized the military. His favorite toy turned serious. He modernized the army using European tactics and uniforms. Soldiers trained with discipline instead of superstition. Muskets replaced old axes, and generals were chosen for skill, not bloodline. He built new forts, drilled new regiments, and personally tested cannons, often too close for comfort. If Peter believed in anything, it was that an empire could be built by hand, gunpowder, and pure willpower. But modernization wasn't just about weapons. Peter wanted education. He opened schools for navigation, mathematics, and engineering, the first of their kind in Russia. He ordered translations of foreign books, printed new textbooks, and encouraged nobles to send their sons abroad to study. For the first time, young Russians were learning Latin verbs instead of church hymns. Some hated it, others loved it. Knowledge was spreading, and it made people both smarter and more dangerous. The church, of course, didn't take this well. They saw Peter's reforms as heresy and fancy shoes. Priests preached that shaving beards and studying science were paths to damnation. Peter's response was simple. He made the church part of the state. The old patriarch's power was replaced by the Holy Synod, a government-run council. The priests now answered to Peter, and God would have to wait in line. As reform spread, so did resistance. Riots broke out, nobles complained, peasants groaned under taxes. But Peter didn't slow down. He sped up. He believed pain meant progress. He personally visited workshops, inspected shipyards, and barked orders with a voice that could shake the rafters. He worked harder than anyone, slept less than everyone, and swore louder than both combined. His energy was terrifying, but it was also contagious. By the early 1700s, Russia was unrecognizable. Beards were shorter, coats were tighter, and the streets were full of noise, workshops, schools, soldiers, and steam. Peter had done what no Tsar before him dared. He forced a medieval nation into the modern world. Yet, for all his triumphs, people whispered that he ruled not with a crown, but with an iron hand. They weren't wrong. Peter didn't just change Russia, he bent it until it fit his vision, and sometimes that bending hurt. Peter had always loved ships. To him, a ship wasn't just wood and sails, it was freedom. It could travel where land couldn't, speak where borders ended, and bring power without bloodshed. Russia had everything: forests, rivers, courage, but no true navy. Peter looked at the map and saw something missing. "We have legs," he said once, "but no boots." A navy would be those boots, and he was ready to build them himself if he had to. Near the White Sea, he ordered shipbuilders to gather wood. Not just any wood, but strong oak that could handle storms. He brought in Dutch and English craftsmen to teach the Russians the art of naval carpentry. Soon the forests echoed with axes, saws, and the smell of pine tar. To most people, it looked like chaos. To Peter, it was music, the first notes of a navy being born. Of course, nothing ever came easy. Russia's ports were few, and most were locked in ice half the year. The Baltic Sea was blocked by Sweden, and the Black Sea was guarded by the Ottoman Empire. It was like wanting to swim but being surrounded by locked doors. So Peter decided to build his navy before he even had access to a real sea. Some called it madness. Peter called it planning ahead. To test his new fleet, Peter returned to his favorite playground, the rivers near Moscow, where his first little toy boat still rested. He organized mock naval battles, complete with small cannons, fake smoke, and cheering onlookers. His enthusiasm was contagious. Soon nobles were sending their sons to learn shipbuilding instead of poetry. Russia was starting to catch the wave. Peter didn't want just a few ships, he wanted a fleet. He founded new shipyards along the Don River, at Voronezh, and later on the Baltic coast. Thousands of workers labored day and night, hammering, sawing, cursing, and singing. Peter worked among them, covered in sawdust, swinging tools, shouting orders, and sometimes throwing them. "A ruler who doesn't work," he said, "has no right to rule." Nobody argued with a Tsar holding a hammer. In 1696, Peter's dream finally touched water. His new ships sailed down the Don River toward the Azov Sea to challenge the Ottoman fortress at Azov. The battle wasn't easy. The Turks were fierce, and the Russians were learning as they fought. But the sight of Russian flags fluttering over the waves was historic. For the first time, Russia had a navy, and it floated beautifully. Peter wept with pride, though he pretended it was just dust in his eye. The victory at Azov changed everything. Peter returned to Moscow like a man reborn. He ordered parades, fireworks, and church bells, not just for himself, but for Russia's new identity as a maritime power. He even founded the Russian Admiralty, a full government department to manage shipbuilding. The old landlocked empire was starting to look like a sea creature stretching its fins for the first time. Peter's obsession with ships turned into something close to religion. He collected miniature models, studied naval battles, and talked about sails more than politics. He even created a new holiday, Navy Day. At parties, instead of drinking to love or God, guests toasted to the fleet. Russia had a new faith, and Peter was its high priest with a spyglass. But Peter's vision was bigger than celebration. He dreamed of building a city, a port that faced the west, a window to Europe. The perfect place, he decided, was on the swampy banks of the Neva River. It was cold, wet, and miserable, but Peter saw beauty in mud. "Here," he said, "we shall build our doorway to the world." That city would become St. Petersburg, his proudest creation, and the crown jewel of his navy. Prampu. Peter's navy wasn't just ships and sailors. It was a symbol. It showed that Russia could change, adapt, and dream bigger than its borders. Each cannon, each sail, each plank carried a piece of his will. The man who once played with toy boats now commanded fleets. The rivers that had once trapped him now carried his empire's ambitions to the seas. The Tsar had found his purpose, and his country had found its wind. Peter's navy was ready. His army was trained. His factories clanged. His cities buzzed. And his beard tax was still making everyone angry. But one thing was missing: respect. Europe still saw Russia as a backwater frozen somewhere east of civilization. Peter wanted to fix that the same way most rulers did in the 1700s, by winning a really big war. His eyes turned toward the Baltic Sea, where Sweden ruled the waves like a smug neighbor with a better lawn. At the time, Sweden was led by King Charles XII, a young warrior barely out of his teens but already a legend. He rode through battlefields like thunder, fearless and unstoppable. Peter thought he could take him easily. He was wrong. In 1700, the Russian army attacked the Swedish fortress of Narva, and within hours Charles crushed them. Snow, wind, and Swedish cannons turned Peter's dream of glory into a nightmare. Half his men froze, the rest ran. It was humiliating. Most rulers would have sulked or blamed their generals. Peter didn't. He rolled up his sleeves, literally, and began rebuilding. He studied what went wrong, retrained his troops, and built new cannons. He even redesigned uniforms so soldiers could move faster. "We lost because we were old," he said, "so we'll become new." He trained peasants into soldiers, taught officers real tactics, and turned defeat into a classroom. Narva had been a disaster, but it was the kind that wakes giants. While Peter rebuilt, Charles XII went on a victory parade across Europe. Poland, Saxony, everywhere. He ignored Russia, thinking the Muscovite bear was beaten for good. Big mistake. Over the next decade, Peter turned his army into a machine. He built new fortresses, new supply routes, and a new fleet on the Baltic coast. The Swedish army didn't know it yet, but Peter was waiting for the perfect moment to strike back, and when he did, he'd come like winter itself. The key to victory, Peter believed, was the Baltic coast. He captured the Swedish fortress of Noteberg in 1702 and renamed it Schlisselburg, meaning key to the kingdom. From there, his army pushed west, capturing more fortresses until he reached the mouth of the Neva River. There, amid swamps and mosquitoes, Peter began building a new city, St. Petersburg. His enemies laughed. "He's building a city in mud," they said. Peter smiled. "Yes, and it will stand on your graves." By 1709, Peter was ready for revenge. His rebuilt army marched to meet Charles XII near the Ukrainian city of Poltava. The battle began at dawn, cannons roaring, muskets flashing through clouds of dust. Charles fought bravely, but was outnumbered and outgunned. The Russians held firm, then counterattacked with precision. When the smoke cleared, Sweden's mighty army was shattered. Peter had done the impossible. He had beaten Europe's best soldier on open ground. After Poltava, Charles fled south to the Ottoman Empire, nursing his wounds and his pride. Peter, meanwhile, celebrated like never before. He ordered parades, minted medals, and toasted his soldiers for days. From the mud of Narva to the glory of Poltava, he declared, "Russia rises." For the first time, Europe took notice. The bear had roared, and the echo reached all the way to London and Paris. But Peter wasn't satisfied with one victory. He wanted dominance. The war dragged on for another decade, as Russia and Sweden wrestled over control of the Baltic. Battles raged at sea, where Peter's navy, once a dream, now proved itself deadly. Russian ships fired broadsides that made the waves tremble. Sailors sang songs that mixed pride with disbelief. They were part of something new, a nation no longer landlocked in spirit. In 1721, after more than 20 years of war, Sweden finally gave up. The Treaty of Nystad ended the Great Northern War and made Russia the new master of the Baltic. Peter celebrated by taking a new title, Emperor of all Russia. The boy who once built toy cannons now ruled one of the largest empires on earth. He had changed Russia's borders, its army, its navy, and even its soul. The Great Northern War had started as a fight for coastline, but it became a war for identity. Peter proved that Russia could fight like Europe, think like Europe, and still remain fiercely Russian. It cost him years, gold, and countless lives, but it gave his nation power and pride. As he watched his ships sail across the Baltic, Peter must have smiled. The world had finally learned what he already knew. Russia was awake, and it was here to stay. After 20 years of war, Peter finally had his prize, access to the Baltic Sea. He'd fought kings, snow, and his own people for it. Now he wanted something permanent, a city that screamed, "Russia belongs to the future." The spot he chose? A swamp. Cold, foggy, mosquito-infested, and miserable. His generals looked around and said, "Here?" Peter grinned. "Exactly here." Building a city there was madness, and Peter loved madness that came with progress. He called it St. Petersburg, after St. Peter, and maybe a little after himself. He ordered thousands of workers, soldiers, and peasants to the site. They cut trees, drained marshes, and hauled stones through freezing rain. The ground swallowed boots and tools alike. Some joked the city was being built on bones. Peter just called it the cost of greatness. Wandkthals the work never stopped. Men swung hammers until their hands bled. Winter froze half the camp. Spring drowned the rest. But the city kept rising, brick by brick, life by life. Peter walked among the workers, sometimes carrying logs himself. He cursed like a sailor and laughed like one too. He didn't rule from a throne, he ruled from the mud. Soon streets began to form, canals were dug, and ships anchored nearby. European architects came with elegant sketches, though most of their drawings had to be adjusted for all the mud. Palaces, churches, warehouses, all began to appear like ghosts from the fog. Peter wanted wide boulevards, not cramped medieval lanes. No more Moscow clutter, he said. This city will breathe. Peter even moved his royal court there, long before the city was finished. Nobles complained bitterly. There are no houses, no roads. Peter smiled. Then build them. They obeyed, because disobeying Peter was far worse than sleeping in a tent. Slowly, grand houses replaced wooden huts, and the marsh began to glitter with candlelight. To speed up construction, Peter made a rule. Every nobleman must build a home here. Some tried to avoid it, but inspectors kept count. Even merchants and craftsmen were ordered to move in. It was as if Peter was dragging his country brick by brick to the edge of Europe and locking the door behind them. Despite the hardship, the city began to bloom. The first ships of Peter's navy docked at the Admiralty Yard, their masts shining against grey clouds. Canals gleamed like mirrors. Bells rang from new churches. To visitors, St. Petersburg looked unreal, a floating dream half made of water and willpower. To Peter, it was proof that vision could grow even from mud. But
the city had a darker side. Thousands died from disease, cold, and exhaustion. The Neva flooded often, washing away months of work. Graves appeared beside building sites. People whispered the place was cursed. Peter ignored the whispers. He saw sacrifice as part of creation.
Rome wasn't built in a day, he said, but this one might drown in a night. By 1712, Peter officially made St. Petersburg the capital of Russia. The church grumbled, the nobles sighed, and Moscow sulked, but the Tsar had spoken. The court packed up icons and chandeliers and headed north. St. Petersburg became the window Peter had promised, a window opening straight into the heart of Europe. Through it, trade, art, and ideas flowed in like sunlight. Years later, when visitors arrived by ship and saw the city's golden domes rising from the mist, they could hardly believe it. A European capital had appeared, where only swamps once existed. Peter stood on the banks of the Neva, hands behind his back, watching the waves. I built it with my hands, he said quietly, and with the hands of many who will never be remembered. St. Petersburg was not just his city, it was his soul turned into stone and water. Peter's new city, St. Petersburg, was shining on the outside, but inside Russia the old habits still clung like frost. The nobles still acted like medieval lords, the church still frowned on change, and peasants still bowed lower than the floor. Peter looked around and said, "We can't build a new world with old bones." So he decided to rebuild the people too. One law, one beard, and one headache at a time. First came the table of ranks. Peter wanted to destroy the idea that birth alone made someone important, so he created a system where people earned titles by service, not bloodline. A peasant who worked hard could rise through the ranks, while a lazy noble could fall. It was revolutionary and terrifying for anyone who'd coasted through life on family privilege. Suddenly, every man in Russia had something new to fear: a performance review. The old system was a mess, overlapping councils, missing paperwork, and bribes so large they could buy a small village. Peter replaced it with a modern bureaucracy, full of departments, secretaries, and official stamps. It was supposed to bring order. Instead, it introduced something new to Russia: endless paperwork. Congratulations, the modern age had arrived. Ron Dos Peter didn't stop with laws. He wanted people to look modern too. Out went the long robes and heavy fur hats. In came European-style coats, breeches, and wigs. Moscow suddenly looked like a costume party sponsored by Paris. Some nobles complained that Western clothes were uncomfortable. Peter replied, "So is progress." And then came the beard war, the strangest battle in Russian history. Peter had long hated beards, calling them relics of ignorance. When he saw a noble with a beard, he grabbed scissors himself. Those who refused to shave had to pay the famous beard tax. The tax came with a small metal token that read, "The beard is a useless burden." The beard wasn't just hair, it was identity. Priests claimed shaving was ungodly. Peasants called Peter the Antichrist. But the Tsar didn't care. To him, a clean face meant a clean break from the past. He even fined merchants at city gates if they arrived too hairy. In a country full of frost, Peter somehow created the hottest fashion argument of the 1700s. But Peter's reforms weren't all vanity. He introduced new schools, hospitals, and industries. He ordered translations of foreign books and sent young Russians abroad to study science and shipbuilding. The Tsar believed education was the key to power, even if half his subjects couldn't read yet. To fix that, he pushed literacy like never before. Slowly, Russia began to think differently, speak differently, and occasionally spell things correctly. Old Russian letters were clunky and slow. He removed some, reshaped others, and created a cleaner, faster script. Printing presses rejoiced. The new alphabet made it easier to publish newspapers and to criticize the Tsar in print. Peter didn't love that part, but he let it happen, mostly. Everyone loved Peter's new order. Nobles whispered that he had gone mad. The church called his city unholy. Peasants muttered prayers to protect themselves from foreign sins. But Peter pressed on. He once said, "I have dragged my country out of the mud. If it screams, that is only proof it's alive." He ruled like a blacksmith. Every blow meant to shape the iron, no matter who got burned. By the 1720s, Russia was almost unrecognizable. Bureaucrats filled offices, soldiers drilled in European uniforms, and nobles shaved daily under protest. It was messy, loud, and sometimes absurd, but it worked. The old medieval giant had finally opened its eyes. Peter's Russia was now a country of factories, fleets, and formalities. The beards might have grown back in secret, but so had ambition. Peter had built cities, armies, and ships, but now he wanted to build minds. He'd seen Europe's universities and laboratories during his travels. He remembered the smell of ink, the ticking of clocks, and the endless questions floating in the air. Russia had churches and superstitions, but not much science. To Peter, that was like having candles but no flame. Knowledge, he said, is the best weapon of all. His dream was to make Russia not only strong but smart. Students learned geometry, astronomy, and mechanics, subjects once considered witchcraft. Many struggled, especially those who couldn't read yet, but Peter had no patience for excuses. Learn, he barked, or row. And if a student didn't learn, well, rowing was still useful for the navy. Peter's curiosity had no limits. He built laboratories inside palaces, collected odd objects from around the world, and even performed medical dissections himself. He wanted to understand the human body, not just rule over it. Once he even tried dentistry, pulling teeth from willing victims. They say his technique was enthusiastic, if not entirely precise. He filled his new capital, St. Petersburg, with the hum of learning. The School of Mathematics and Navigation trained future captains and shipbuilders. A medical college was opened to teach anatomy and surgery. For the first time, young Russians were studying the stars, the sea, and the body, instead of only holy texts. Knowledge was becoming sacred in its own way. In 1714, Peter founded the Kunstkamera, Russia's first museum. It was filled with fossils, insects, maps, and strange curiosities in jars. People came from far away just to gawk at them. Some found it fascinating. Others whispered that it was witchcraft. Peter didn't care. Better to fear ignorance, he said, than to fear a frog in a jar. He didn't stop there. Peter established the Russian Academy of Sciences, inviting foreign scholars to teach and research. They brought microscopes, books, and funny accents. Language barriers caused confusion. One French scientist once asked for salt and got handed a soldier's rifle instead. Still, Peter's empire of science grew, one experiment and one mistranslation at a time. Peter also loved technology. He studied printing presses, clocks, and ship engines with childlike excitement. Once he spent hours watching gears move inside a clock, calling it a universe in a box. He ordered workshops built all over the empire to produce machines, glass, and tools. Russia's hands, once rough from plows, were learning the elegance of precision. Still, science and reason didn't erase the old fears overnight. Many Russians thought Peter's reforms were dangerous. Some said the Tsar had sold his soul to foreign devils. Others refused to send their sons to godless schools. But Peter never backed down. He said, "If light scares them, I will build more lamps." His empire, once dark and silent, began to flicker with curiosity. By the 1720s, Russia had its first scientists, doctors, and naval engineers. Newspapers printed stories about comets and foreign inventions. People began debating ideas in taverns instead of rumors. Peter had done more than modernize. He had taught a nation to wonder. For the first time, curiosity wasn't a sin, it was a skill. One night, Peter looked out from his study over the Neva River. The moonlight shimmered on the city he'd built, and on the minds he'd awakened. Russia was no longer just land and soldiers, it was thinkers, dreamers, and builders. He smiled and whispered, "Now we can see." He wasn't just the Tsar of ships or laws, he was the Tsar of ideas. Peter had reshaped almost everything, the army, the government, even fashion. But there was one mountain still standing in his way, the church. In old Russia, the Orthodox Church wasn't just a religion, it was the backbone of daily life. Priests blessed crops, ruled families, and told people what God thought about everything from sin to soup. And above them all sat the patriarch, the spiritual twin of the Tsar. For centuries, Russia had two rulers, one with a crown and one with a cross. Peter respected faith, but not superstition. To him, too many priests were blocking progress like stone walls against the wind. They discouraged science, feared foreigners, and hated his reforms. When he ordered people to shave their beards, the church called it blasphemy. God made hair for a reason, they cried. Peter replied, Yes, to clog the drain. When Peter was still a boy, church leaders sided with his sister Sophia during the rebellions. He never forgot it. Now, as Tsar, he was ready to settle the score, not through vengeance but through reform. When the old patriarch Adrian died in 1700, Peter refused to appoint a new one. He said Russia didn't need two heads, one was enough. He placed the church under state control and formed the Holy Synod, a council of bishops who reported directly to him. Religion would now serve the state, not the other way around. To some this was genius, to others it was heresy wrapped in paperwork. Of course, Peter's version of reform wasn't gentle. He taxed monasteries, took control of church lands, and made priests report crimes they heard in confession. He even banned pilgrimages unless they got government permission first. The holy men who once blessed the Tsar now needed his blessing to travel. Power had flipped like a coin and Peter was holding it tightly. Yet Peter wasn't trying to destroy faith, only superstition. He believed religion should make people better, not smaller. He ordered priests to preach about honesty, hard work, and loyalty instead of endless fire and brimstone. God loves labor, he said. He built the world, didn't he? It was practical spirituality, less about miracles, more about morning shifts. Still, not everyone shared Peter's vision. Old believers, those who refused his changes, went into hiding, keeping their ancient rituals alive in secret. Some lived in forests, others in caves, clutching the old ways like a lifeline. They prayed for the mad Tsar's downfall. But history was on Peter's side. While they clung to the past, he was dragging the nation toward tomorrow. The church, stripped of its independence, became part of the machinery of the state. Priests were now civil servants in cassocks. Many resented it, but Peter saw results. Fewer rebellions, more discipline, and better control. He believed a single chain of command, from God to him to everyone else, made Russia strong. Whether it made it happy was another question. By bringing the church to heel, Peter sent a clear message. No power in Russia was above the Tsar. The altar and the throne were now one. It was a daring move, and one that would echo for centuries. Later rulers, even the harshest ones, would copy his model, blending faith with authority, until the two were almost indistinguishable. Peter didn't live to see how deeply his church reforms changed Russia. But as he looked out over St. Petersburg's shining domes, he knew one thing for certain. He had turned religion from ruler into servant, and superstition into structure. He had bent faith toward the future. Whether that was holy or heretical, he left for history to decide. For all his greatness, Peter the Great was still human, restless, impatient, and hopelessly complicated when it came to love. He could command armies, but not his heart. His story wasn't just about battles and ships. It was also about wives, lovers, and heartbreak. Behind the Iron Tsar stood women who loved him, feared him, and sometimes defied him, each leaving their mark on the man who tried to modernize an empire. His first wife was Eudoxia Lopakina, chosen for him by his mother. She was beautiful, quiet, and deeply traditional, the perfect bride for an old-fashioned Russia, and the worst possible match for a man who wanted a new one. They married when Peter was just 17. He preferred shipyards, she preferred prayer. He liked European music, she liked silence. It was less a marriage and more a polite Cold War. Peter spent most of their marriage away from her, building ships, fighting wars, and studying in Europe. Eudoxia stayed in Moscow, surrounded by priests and gossip. She hated his reforms, hated his foreign friends, and eventually just hated him. When Peter came home covered in sawdust, talking about Dutch engineers, she looked at him like he'd joined a cult. "You've changed," she said. "Good," he answered. Eventually Peter had enough. He sent Eudoxia to a convent, officially for spiritual reflection, though everyone knew it was a royal divorce in disguise. She protested, but Peter was immovable. "A Tsar can rebuild a nation," he said. "He can also rebuild his life." She was gone, and in her place fate brought someone completely different, a woman who would stand beside him, not behind him. Her name was Marta Skavronskaya, a peasant girl of no noble blood. She worked as a servant in a household Peter visited, and somehow caught his eye. She was clever, funny, and fearless enough to speak her mind, something no court lady dared to do. Peter admired that. Soon Marta became Catherine, baptized into the Orthodox faith, and eventually became his second wife. Catherine was nothing like the first empresses of Russia. She laughed loudly, argued freely, and followed Peter on campaigns, even to the battlefield. While cannon smoke filled the air, she helped organize supplies, nursed the wounded, and calmed her husband's storms of anger. Soldiers called her Mother of the Army. Peter called her My Strength. Together they had 12 children, though only 2 survived into adulthood, a pain that haunted both of them. Between grief and exhaustion, Catherine became Peter's anchor. She understood his moods better than anyone. When he raged, she waited. When he laughed, she joined him. And when he doubted himself, she reminded him that greatness was always lonely. But love didn't erase Peter's dark side. He could be tender one moment and terrifying the next. His temper was legendary, quick, loud, and dangerous. His relationship with his son Alexei from his first marriage proved that. Alexei was gentle, cautious, and everything Peter wasn't. Father and son clashed constantly. Peter wanted a soldier, Alexei wanted peace. Their fights grew colder until one day, they stopped speaking at all. When Alexei fled abroad to escape his father's anger, Peter's fury turned to heartbreak. He had him brought back to Russia, accused of plotting rebellion, and imprisoned. Under interrogation, Alexei confessed, maybe out of fear, maybe out of guilt. Days later, he died in his cell. Some said torture, others said sorrow. Peter never spoke of it again, but those close to him said it aged him overnight. He'd won the world, but lost his son. In the end, it was Catherine who stood by him when everything else, family, friends, even faith, fell away. She was there in triumph and tragedy, laughter and loss. When Peter's health began to fail, she nursed him like she had nursed his soldiers, and after his death, she would wear the crown herself, becoming Empress Catherine I, the peasant girl who became the ruler of an empire. Love had made her royal, and loss had made her strong. Peter had done what few men in history ever managed. He'd remade an entire country, but behind his brilliance there was a darkness that grew like a shadow at noon. The same fire that fueled his genius also burned those who stood too close. He wasn't just a reformer, he was a tyrant too. He built with one hand and destroyed with the other, convinced that the end always justified the means. When people resisted his reforms, he didn't debate, he punished. The Streltsy rebellion was his warning to the nation. He executed hundreds, their bodies left hanging as lessons carved in flesh. He even forced nobles to watch. It wasn't cruelty for pleasure, it was cruelty for control. In Peter's mind, discipline was mercy, wearing an iron mask. Even his closest friends weren't safe. Those who betrayed him or simply annoyed him too much found themselves exiled, beaten, or worse. He drank with them one day and interrogated them the next. Power had isolated him. The more he reformed the world, the fewer people could look him in the eye. Peter had built a new Russia, but he'd built walls around his own heart too. He worked endlessly, inspecting shipyards, rewriting laws, drilling soldiers, designing schools. He slept little, ate quickly, and shouted often. He wasn't just ruling an empire, he was personally supervising its every nail and coin. When workers failed, he cursed them. When ministers delayed, he replaced them. Russia must move forward, he said, even if I have to drag it by its hair. And he did. His temper was legendary. He could explode over small things, a crooked uniform, a dirty street, a missing nail. Once he slapped a noble so hard during a meeting that the man fainted on the spot. Then Peter calmly continued the discussion as if nothing happened. People learned to nod quickly, agree faster, and never ever make him repeat himself. And yet, for all his harshness, Peter was not a monster without a heart. He truly believed that every act of force was a necessary medicine, bitter but healing. When he punished, he thought he was curing. When he destroyed old customs, he thought he was saving souls from ignorance. The tragedy was that he never learned the difference between building strength and breaking spirit. His people feared him, but they also admired him. Soldiers adored his bravery. Commoners whispered that he worked harder than anyone. He shared their hardships, ate their food, and even cursed like them. In an age of pampered kings, Peter was a laborer in royal clothes, equal parts hero and headache. To the world, he looked unstoppable. To those closest to him, he looked exhausted. Over the years, the pressure of rule carved him like stone. His body ached, his face aged, his mind grew heavy. He began to speak of destiny and duty more than dreams. Sometimes he would stare at the horizon in silence, as if asking himself whether it had all been worth it, the blood, the fear, the loneliness. But he never slowed down. Greatness, once started, doesn't know how to stop. To his critics, Peter was a tyrant who crushed tradition and ruled through terror. To his admirers, he was a visionary who turned Russia into a modern power. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in between. A man who wanted the light so badly he set half the forest on fire to get it. His reforms burned bright, but they also burned deep. By the time Peter looked back on his life, he saw an empire forever changed, and a man who could never change back. He had built Russia's future, but lost pieces of his soul along the way. History would remember him as both creator and destroyer, savior and tyrant, hammer and storm. He had dragged his country into the modern world and left his humanity somewhere along the road. By the 1720s, Peter the Great was no longer the restless young Tsar hammering nails in shipyards. His hair had greyed, His body ached, but his ambition still burned. He'd built cities, crushed armies, and reshaped a nation, yet peace bored him. He once said, "Rest is for the dead," so he kept moving, chasing one last dream, expanding Russia's reach to the warm southern seas. In 1722 he launched the Persian campaign, marching his troops through heat, dust and mountains. The soldiers joked that the Tsar had finally found a place hotter than his temper. Despite sickness, rough terrain and endless logistics, Peter pressed forward, capturing cities along the western coast. It wasn't just about land, it was about legacy. Peter dreamed of linking Russia to the east through trade routes and ports. He imagined caravans carrying silk and spices to St. Petersburg, the Baltic meeting the Caspian like two hands shaking. To him, every fortress built and map redrawn was a message to the future. Russia belongs everywhere. But the campaign came at a price. The heat was brutal, the diseases worse. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion, and supplies ran thin. Peter himself fell ill more than once, though he refused to rest. "If I stop," he told his generals, "so does Russia." The campaign succeeded. Persia ceded territory and trade rights, but the Tsar's health was crumbling faster than any fortress wall. When he returned home, St. Petersburg was thriving. The city he had dreamed from mud now glistened with palaces and ships. The Admiralty spire pierced the sky like a golden arrow. Peter spent his days inspecting docks, schools and foundries. Even while coughing and limping, he worked tirelessly, scribbling notes, signing decrees, and still shouting at lazy officials. "My sickness," he joked, "is that I can't stop." He also turned his attention to science and art, his quieter battles. He ordered more schools, libraries and botanical gardens. Foreign artists painted the empire he'd built, and Russian scholars began writing about their land with pride. He wasn't just ruling a country anymore, he was crafting its soul. Peter wanted Russia to be admired not just for its strength, but for its mind. Still, his restlessness never faded. He visited shipyards in the freezing rain, inspected soldiers at dawn, and even dove into icy water to rescue stranded sailors. That last act, brave but foolish, nearly killed him. He caught a severe chill and refused treatment. When doctors begged him to rest, he waved them away. "A Tsar," he said, "doesn't die in bed. Ronrak." His health worsened through the winter of 1725. Fever, pain and exhaustion drained him, but he still signed documents from his bed. Catherine never left his side, holding his hand through long nights. On his final morning he whispered to her, "Finish what I have begun." Those were his last words, not of love or regret, but of duty. Even at death's door, Peter was still building something. After his death, Russia fell silent. Bells tolled across St. Petersburg. Thousands lined the streets as his coffin passed, soldiers, workers and nobles alike. Some wept openly, others simply stood in awe. They weren't just burying a man, they were burying the storm that had shaped their world. For decades, people would still start sentences with, "in Peter's time," as if it were a whole different era. He left shipyards, schools, cities, laws, and a new way of thinking. He had dragged Russia from medieval shadows into the modern age. His hands built, his will commanded, and his mind dreamed. The cost had been heavy, in lives, peace and his own soul, but his legacy stood like a monument carved in ice and iron. As the Neva's waves lapped against the city he made, it was as if the water whispered his name. The giant was dying. After a lifetime of storms, Peter the Great's body had finally begun to give up. His legs swelled, his breathing came in gasps, and his strength, once the power of an army, was slipping away like sand through fingers. Yet even in pain, he refused to rest. His mind raced with plans, decrees, ship designs, reforms, anything to keep the silence of death from catching him too soon. He had caught the illness months earlier, diving into the icy Neva River to save stranded sailors. It was a heroic act, but a foolish one. The freezing water infected his bladder and kidneys. Doctors tried bloodletting, leeches and prayers. None of it helped. The man who could rebuild nations now struggled to walk across his own room. Still, when visitors entered, he straightened his back and greeted them with the same booming voice. "The Tsar is not weak." Catherine never left his side. She wiped his brow, read him reports, and whispered updates from the city he'd built. Outside, St. Petersburg buzzed with progress, ships setting sail, factories humming, children attending schools he'd founded. Inside his room, time seemed to slow. The man who had dragged Russia into the modern age now lay still, surrounded by the world he had created. Even in his final days, Peter worked. When his hands trembled too much to write, he dictated letters. When his voice failed, he gestured. His last decree, half finished, lay on his desk. "Leave all to." The sentence trailed off mid-word, the ink blot spreading like a dark tear. Historians have argued for centuries what he meant to say. Maybe he didn't know himself. He died on February 8, 1725, as the winter sun rose over the Neva River. Catherine held his hand until the last breath left his chest. The palace fell silent. Guards outside wept openly, unsure whether to mourn their ruler or the force of nature that had kept them moving for decades. The giant who had lifted a nation had finally laid down his hammer. The news spread quickly. Church bells rang, soldiers fired muskets in salute, and people across the empire fell to their knees. Some cried from grief, others from fear, for they wondered what Russia would be without him. The streets of St. Petersburg were lined with mourners holding candles that flickered in the cold wind. For a moment it felt as if the entire city exhaled. Peter's body was placed in a silver coffin inside the unfinished St. Peter and Paul Cathedral, the church he had ordered built himself. The walls still smelled of fresh plaster. The sound of hammers echoed faintly as priests chanted prayers. It was as if his final construction site had become his tomb. Even in death, the Tsar was still building something. Roman ambassadors came to pay their respects. They looked around at the city he'd made from swamps and shook their heads in disbelief. He changed the world, one whispered. And himself too. For Europe, Peter was no longer the wild barbarian from the East. He was a legend. A man who had forced his way into history with bare hands and unrelenting will. Catherine, now empress, wept in private but ruled in public. She promised to continue his vision, though no one could ever fill the space he left behind. At night, she often visited the riverbank where he'd saved those sailors, watching the frozen water shimmer under moonlight. The wind there carried whispers, the sound of a man who refused to be forgotten. Years later, people still told stories about him, the Tsar who worked like a peasant, cursed like a soldier, and dreamed like a god. His legacy towered over Russia like a monument carved into time. St. Petersburg became his eternal echo, the city of water, stone and willpower. The giant had died, but his footsteps were still heard in every wave that touched its shore. Time passed, but Peter the Great never truly left Russia. His shadow stretched across the centuries like the mast of a great ship on calm water. The empire he built continued to grow, ruled by men and women who lived in the world he created. A world of uniforms, factories and ambition. Even long after his death, Russia still moved to the rhythm of Peter's footsteps. His reforms had changed everything. The army, the navy, the schools, even how people dressed. But what they changed most was how Russia thought about itself. Before Peter, it was a land of closed borders and old traditions. After him, it was a nation looking outward, reaching toward the west, curious about what lay beyond. He had opened a window, and the cold wind of progress would never stop blowing through it. Of course, not everyone agreed on what that progress meant. To some, Peter was a visionary, a ruler who lifted Russia from medieval sleep. To others, he was a tyrant, who ruled through fear and blood. Historians still argue, was he a hero who modernized, or a monster who westernized too fast? Maybe he was both. After all, even the brightest light casts a long shadow. What couldn't be denied was his impact. The navy he built still sailed. The city he founded still glittered. The schools he opened still taught. Every coin, every ship, every church bell carried his fingerprint. It was as if his will had soaked into the stone and water of Russia itself, refusing to fade. Few rulers can be felt in the bones of a nation. Peter was one of them. Later rulers tried to follow in his footsteps. Catherine the Great, his spiritual successor, admired his vision and expanded his reforms. Others tried to imitate his power, but missed his purpose. Peter had worked, fought, and bled beside his people. He demanded much because he gave much. His crown had been heavy, but his hands had been calloused, something few monarchs could say. In the centuries that followed, Russia changed again and again, revolutions, emperors, wars, but Peter's spirit always lingered. Every time the nation looked westward, built a new city, or dreamed of greatness, his voice seemed to whisper from the past, work harder, think bigger, don't stop. He had become less of a man and more of a myth, part of the country's very soul. Even his city became a symbol of him. St. Petersburg, with its canals, bridges and endless grey skies, felt alive, half European, half Russian, entirely Peter's creation. Some called it the Venice of the North, others called it his ghost, built in stone. When the wind blew off the Baltic, locals said it carried his laughter, rough, impatient and proud. But Peter's legacy was more than monuments. It lived in the Russian spirit, that strange mix of endurance, stubbornness and imagination. He taught his people to believe they could master the impossible, even if it hurt, to reach the sea through ice, to build a city on mud, to turn backwardness into brilliance. That lesson outlived him by centuries. Today, Peter's monuments still stand tall, bronze and unyielding. Tourists pose beneath his statue, unaware that the real man was far more complicated than the legend. He wasn't born great, he built greatness the hard way, through mistakes, rage, and relentless work. Maybe that's why people still admire him. He reminds us that change, real change, is never gentle, but it's always possible. In the end, Peter the Great was exactly what history needed him to be, a storm that woke a sleeping giant. He tore down walls, broke traditions, and built a bridge between centuries. And though he's long gone, his echo still drifts across the waters of the Neva. A giant may fall, but his shadow, like his city, remains.